Hello, welcome to your review. I'm going to try to do this through video, and I do apologize that I was not feeling well. I am still sick, so excuse my voice, and I have a cough drop in right now. But it is my hope to tell you what I think is important for your final Tuesday at 7 in our regular room. Again, you do not need to bring a Scantron. So if you've been looking at the study guide, as you know, in class, I usually go through these and say, know this is really important. So that's pretty much what I'm going to do for you. And looking all the way back to when we started talking about leadership and power and influence, these are chapters 5 and 6 in the text. The sources of power are very important, and they are all over the exam. And instead of just knowing them as a definition, I would give an example of how that type of power might be used in an organization. So, if Manager Bob says, look, I'm the president, this is what you're going to do, to Jeannie and Joe, I give little scenarios. Put each type of power in a little scenario or an example. I think that will help you a lot. There is an excellent review of the benefits and costs of these six power bases on page 143 in your textbook. Worth looking at. Okay. I do ask a question about indicators of power. Mostly that is about powerless communication. And of course, what we mean by that is when we say things that already diminish what we're saying, like, well, I'm not sure what I'm saying, but tags, hedges, qualifiers, these do tend to be used more by women. And I give you one example of indicator of power question, so not a lot on that. This status communication behaviors of high and low status, these were two very long lists that are nowhere in the text. They were only in lecture. And I will tell you right now, they're great true false, and that's where they will appear. So I may say something like true or false, high status members complain less. That is actually true. High status members usually do not complain. You usually get most of your complaints from your lower status members. So again, they were a bunch of bullet point from the PowerPoint. They're not in the book, but they're great indicators of high and low status. So that's going to be on there. Definitely want to take time out for these compliance gaining tactics because they're on there. And the book does a really great job. And I will give you the page number, as I believe we're actually in chapter 6 for these influence compliance gaining techniques. And they give you an example, and you starts on page 173. So they give you the strategy and they give you an example. And you better believe, what am I going to do on the test? Give you an example, and you have to tell me which compliance gaining strategy is being used. Okay? That's straight up, give you an example, you put the strategy behind it. Why do people comply? These are pretty easy. I throw you one question on this, I believe, just generally, why are we persuaded to do things? Generally because we like someone. Remember, social proof is we see other people doing it, so we do it too. Authority. Remember, we looked at the video of the will you shock someone and talk about the Milgram studies. And we will comply with authority all the time. We are very, very compliant to authority. So if we think someone has authority over us, we will comply. And if we can't get something, if something is scarce, we're more likely to do what people want us to in hopes that we might get whatever it is that is scarce. So coming into verbal aggression, argumentativeness are two types of communication. Verbal aggression, we say, attacks the person. Argumentativeness is about the argument. And I don't know if I ask you too much about that. All right, defensive versus supportive communication. This is huge. You better know these. If you want to do well on this test, you will go read that article. You will put down the six different types, 12 altogether. All 12 are on the test. So I would really, really know the six supportive and six defensive opposite techniques. The article is on Blackboard. It's the one I wrote. Um, it was about creating climate and why climate is so critical. It was a critical lecture that we had in class. I think very few people showed up, so check those out. They are not in the book, and it's a huge portion of your test. We then went to characteristics of good negotiators and types of negotiation styles. These are also talked about in your text. I only put 3 down here, and I gave you the tit for tat, which is mostly negative. I also gave you positional bargaining, so hard bargaining and soft bargaining. And then I gave you one not in your text again, but that I like. It seems to work really well with the graduated and reciprocal initiatives. Know those steps. Know that the graduated and reciprocal initiatives and tension reduction is a positive strategy if there was a true false on that. Remember, tit for tat, not positive, usually ends in a negative spiral of reciprocation. Excuse me. So something to think about there. All right, so 5 and 6, mostly all about power and influence. We then moved into chapter 7 in the book, which is groups and teams. Definitely note the definition of a group or what makes a group. And that's 6 people generally who are interdependent. It's a key word, and create shared meaning. You absolutely need to know what makes groups different from teams. Teams tend to have more diverse skills, more diverse skills. They also tend to have an identity, and they tend to they actually list some of these, what makes a team different from a group, in your text. And I would definitely take a look at some of the information involved in what makes a team different from a group. Page 217 is a nice little chart that contrasts groups from teams. Okay. There are 6 factors of effective team members. This is not in your text. This is according to Larson and LaFasto, who are some of the utmost researchers. In small groups, they observed literally 10,000 different small groups or teams and said this is what they're looking for. So do know what those factors are. That's important. Okay, SimLog. I will tell you that the SimLog is on here, but however, we didn't do it. It is a consulting technique that looks at the systematic multiple level observation of groups. It's a consulting technique that I am trained in, and when I go into organizations and help them with their teams and groups, I will often SimLog an organization. You don't need to know anything about it. We had a more leadership lecture. This looks short, but there is a ton of information in here. So don't be deceived by the shortness of the study guide. Do know the origins of servant leadership. Where does it come from? There are the characteristics of servant leadership. I want to say off the top of my head, there's 11 of them right now. You know those characteristics. And you really need to know that model, the antecedent conditions. We spent a whole class period. Remember, I had you write about that model in class and applying it to higher education. So I'm going to be asking you questions around examples of that model. So it'd be worth your time to go back to the servant leadership article and look up that model. Authentic leadership, again, I put 3 things here, but there's so much more. So on the authentic side, where does authentic leadership stem from? Where did that one come from? It comes out of transformational leadership, in case you are unsure. There's 2 approaches. You definitely should know the 2 different approaches, as well as the 3 kind of different levels that authentic leadership happens on. And we talked about those in class, and they were in the PowerPoint as well. So when you're thinking about this, it looks very short here on the screen, but there's a ton of information in the leadership characteristics wheel, the resources, everything that goes into it, and the 3 different levels. I talked about knowing what emotional intelligence is and the 4 areas. We covered that on the very last class. And then we got into ethics. I do want you to know who is responsible for the ethics of leadership. Is it just the followers? Is it just the leaders? Hopefully you know it's both. I do want you to be able to tell me a couple of the ethical perspectives. That's where you want to focus your time here. In other words, what is Kant's categorical imperative? What is utilitarianism? What is virtue ethics? And justice is fairness. I will not ask you about the veil of ignorance. We never got that far in the last class, but certainly those ethical perspectives are what I'm most interested in. The other information under ethics, I think, is general. That you're sensitive, you use good judgment, all of that. I think on the challenges of leadership, probably I ask you about responsibility. It's both the responsibility of the leader and the follower. It is also, I think, one of the big issues under the challenges is consistency. And we talked about that because, especially in education, a lot of people wrote in and said, can I get an extension on my leadership paper? And I had to say no. Because I have to be consistent. If I do it for one person, I have to do it for all of you. You have to be consistent, and you have to definitely take on the responsibility and manage things ethically. I do believe that ethics has a place in leadership, as most of you know. So obviously it's different when you're not asking questions, but if you had to look at anything, I would spend some time on the servant and authentic leadership chapters. Definitely look at those models and graphs. They are up for you on Blackboard. The other, honestly, very big one is the defensive versus supportive communication. I'm not saying the other stuff isn't on there, but those could sink you. If you do not know anything about authentic or servant leadership or defensive versus supportive communication, this test will not be good for you. So I think that's where you should focus your time. The power bases, the compliance gaining is definitely on there. Again, do not worry about the SimLog. Definitely check out servant and authentic. I would not stress too much on the emotional intelligence or the ethics portion. The biggest thing you'll have to know out of ethics is, again, the different perspectives here. Okay, well, please feel free to email me if you have questions. Otherwise, I will see you on Tuesday. And obviously, I'm here. I'm alive, unfortunately. And I will see you at the final. And I hope this was helpful to you. All right, guys. Study ethically, please.